My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 35 years old, I thought buying my dream home in the prestigious Willowbrook Estates would be the beginning of my happily ever after. I had no idea it would become a battleground that would test everything. I believed about justice, community, and standing up to bullies who abuse their power. What started as a simple dispute over my grandmother's rose garden would expose a corruption scandal that reached the highest levels of our homeowners association and change our entire neighborhood forever. After years of saving every penny from my job as a high school biology teacher, I finally had enough for a down payment on a house in Willowbrook Estates, one of those picture-perfect suburban communities where every lawn looks like it belongs on a magazine cover and property values never seem to decline. The house I fell in love with was a charming colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch, but what really captured my heart was the backyard. The previous owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, had spent 30 years cultivating the most beautiful garden I had ever seen. Roses of every color imaginable climbed wooden trellises, creating natural walls of blooming beauty that provided privacy and filled the air with an intoxicating fragrance that made you feel like you were living in a fairy tale. Mrs. Hartwell was 92 years old and moving to an assisted living facility, but during our final walkthrough, she took my hands in her weathered fingers and made me promise something that would later change everything. "Sarah, dear, this garden has been my life's work for 3 decades. These roses have varieties that date back over 100 years. Some of them are practically extinct in modern cultivation. Promise me you'll take care of them and never let anyone destroy what we've built together." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears as she explained how each section of the garden represented different chapters of her life, how she had propagated rare heirloom varieties from cuttings her own grandmother had brought from Ireland in the 1920s. I promised her that day that I would protect her legacy, having no idea that within 6 months I would be fighting the most powerful people in our community to keep that promise. The trouble started almost immediately after I moved in during the first week of September. I was outside watering the roses early one morning when a black Mercedes pulled into my driveway and a woman in an expensive pantsuit stepped out with the kind of confident stride that suggested she was used to getting her way in every situation. She introduced herself as Margaret Harrison, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and her first words should have warned me about the battle that was coming. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to discuss some concerns about your property that have come to our attention," she said, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed inspection report. "Your garden violates several key provisions of our community guidelines, specifically regarding approved plant varieties, fence height restrictions, and maintenance standards that ensure neighborhood uniformity." I stood there in my pajamas and gardening gloves, completely bewildered by the idea that growing beautiful flowers could somehow be considered a violation of anything. Margaret continued with the kind of bureaucratic precision that made it clear she had delivered similar speeches many times before. The Willowbrook Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions clearly state that all landscaping must conform to approved species lists and design standards that maintain property values and aesthetic consistency throughout our community. Your roses exceed the maximum height allowance for decorative plants. The trellis structures require Architectural Review Board approval, and several of the flower varieties are not on our approved cultivation list. You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance or face escalating fines that begin at $500 per week. I tried to explain that these were rare heirloom roses with historical significance, that they had been growing here for 30 years without causing any problems, and that removing them would destroy something irreplaceable that belonged to our community's heritage. Margaret's response was delivered with the kind of cold smile that politicians use when they want to appear reasonable, while doing something completely unreasonable. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand your emotional attachment to these plants, but rules exist for good reasons. Property values in Willowbrook Estates are among the highest in the county because we maintain standards that other communities lack. Individual preferences cannot be allowed to undermine the collective investment that every resident has made in this neighborhood." That night, I spent hours reading through the HOA documents I had signed during the home purchase, documents that my real estate agent had assured me were standard boilerplate language that never caused problems for normal homeowners. What I discovered was a legal framework so complex and restrictive that it regulated everything from the exact shade of white you could paint your front door to the specific breeds of dogs that were permitted in backyards. The landscaping section alone was 12 pages of detailed specifications about plant heights, color schemes, maintenance schedules, and approval processes that seemed designed to give the HOA board absolute control over every flower, shrub, and blade of grass in the entire neighborhood. The more I read, the more I realized that Margaret Harrison and her board had created a system where they could find violations on any property whenever they wanted to target a particular homeowner. The rules were so numerous and detailed that compliance was practically impossible, and the enforcement mechanisms gave them power to impose devastating financial penalties that could force people to sell their homes rather than fight lengthy legal battles they couldn't afford. I was dealing with a sophisticated form of legalized extortion, disguised as community standards enforcement. My first attempt at negotiating a compromise came the following week, when I requested a meeting with the Architectural Review Board to discuss alternative solutions that might satisfy their concerns, while preserving the most historically significant parts of Mrs. Hartwell's garden. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse, and I arrived with a carefully prepared presentation that included photographs of each rose variety, historical documentation of their heritage significance, and a proposed modification plan that would bring the garden into technical compliance while maintaining its essential character. The review board consisted of Margaret Harrison and 4 other residents who had been appointed to their positions rather than elected, giving Margaret effective control over decisions that could make or break any homeowner's life in Willowbrook Estates. When I began my presentation, explaining the historical value of roses that represented living connections to 19th century cultivation techniques, Margaret interrupted with the kind of dismissive tone that made it clear she had already decided the outcome before I had even entered the room. "Mrs. Mitchell, this board appreciates your passion for gardening, but we cannot make exceptions to established policies based on sentimental attachments or personal preferences," she said, not even looking at the photographs I had carefully prepared. "If we allow one resident to exceed height restrictions and plant non-approved species, we create precedents that undermine our entire regulatory framework. The garden must be removed and replaced with landscaping that conforms to community standards within the original 30-day deadline, or fines will begin accumulating at the rate previously specified." I tried to appeal to their sense of community, pride, and historical preservation, pointing out that Mrs. Hartwell's garden had been featured in several gardening magazines and attracted visitors from across the state who came to see rare rose varieties that were disappearing from modern cultivation. I offered to create educational signage that would turn the garden into an asset that enhanced property values, rather than threatening them. I even proposed opening the garden for community events that would bring positive attention to Willowbrook Estates, as a neighborhood that valued both beauty and heritage. The other board members remained silent throughout my presentation, occasionally nodding when Margaret made dismissive comments, but never asking questions or expressing any genuine interest in finding solutions that might work for everyone involved. It became clear that this was not actually a review process, but rather a formality designed to create the appearance of due process, while rubber-stamping decisions that had already been made behind closed doors. The meeting ended with Margaret reiterating the 30-day deadline and warning me that continued non-compliance would result in legal action that could include liens against my property and forced sale to recover accumulated fines and legal fees. Walking home that night through streets lined with identical mailboxes and perfectly manicured lawns that looked like they had been designed by computers rather than human beings, I felt the weight of fighting a system that seemed specifically designed to crush individual resistance to collective conformity. But I also felt something else rising in my chest, something that reminded me why I had become a teacher in the first place. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when the odds seem impossible, especially when you're protecting something that matters more than your own convenience or comfort. The turning point came when I decided to research Margaret Harrison's background and discovered information that would transform my understanding of what I was really fighting against. A quick internet search revealed that Margaret was not just a concerned community volunteer, but rather the owner of Harrison Landscaping Services, the largest commercial gardening company in our county. Her business specialized in installing and maintaining the kind of standardized, low-maintenance landscaping that filled every yard in Willowbrook Estates. She had a direct financial interest in forcing residents to remove unique gardens and replace them with cookie-cutter designs that required professional maintenance contracts. Further investigation revealed that Harrison Landscaping Services held exclusive maintenance contracts for common areas throughout Willowbrook Estates, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual revenue from HOA fees that every resident paid through their monthly assessments. Margaret had created a system where she could use her position as board president to eliminate competition from residents who maintained their own distinctive gardens, while simultaneously generating business for her company by forcing expensive landscaping replacements that happened to match her company's standard service offerings. The conflict of interest was so obvious that I couldn't believe other residents hadn't noticed the corruption, but when I started talking to my neighbors about Margaret's dual role as HOA president and landscape contractor, I discovered something even more disturbing. Most residents were afraid to speak openly about problems with the HOA because they had seen what happened to people who challenged board decisions. Over the past 3 years, 5 families had been forced to sell their homes due to escalating fines and legal fees related to HOA violations, and in each case, the properties had been purchased by investors connected to board members at prices well below market value. I realized I wasn't just fighting to save Mrs. Hartwell's roses. I was uncovering a systematic scheme that used HOA regulations to manipulate property values and generate profits for a small group of people who had turned community service into a personal enrichment opportunity. The stakes were much higher than I had initially understood, and Margaret's aggressive enforcement of garden regulations was probably just one small part of a much larger pattern of abuse that affected the entire neighborhood. My strategy shifted from trying to negotiate with the board to building a coalition of residents who could challenge the entire system of corruption that had taken control of our community. I started by reaching out to the previous homeowners who had been forced to sell their properties due to HOA violations, and what I discovered was a pattern of targeted harassment that followed the same playbook in every case. First, board members would identify properties they wanted to acquire or residents they wanted to eliminate. Then they would conduct intensive inspections that found multiple violations of obscure regulations that other residents were allowed to ignore. Finally, they would impose escalating fines and legal fees that made it financially impossible for targeted families to remain in their homes. The most heartbreaking story came from David and Linda Thompson, a retired couple who had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 15 years before being forced out by violations related to their vegetable garden and the color of their front door trim. Linda explained through tears how they had spent their entire retirement savings fighting HOA fines that eventually totaled over $40,000 for infractions that included growing tomatoes in their backyard and using the wrong shade of beige paint on their shutters. After they finally gave up and sold their house, it was purchased by Margaret Harrison's nephew for $60,000 below the appraised value. The pattern was clear, and the victims were always the same type of people: elderly residents on fixed incomes, single parents who couldn't afford legal representation, and anyone who had distinctive property features that didn't match the sterile uniformity that board members preferred. Margaret and her allies had weaponized HOA regulations to systematically remove residents they considered undesirable, while enriching themselves through property manipulation and exclusive service contracts that eliminated competition and guaranteed profits. Armed with this information, I reached out to local investigative journalists and discovered that Patricia Williams from Channel 7 News had been tracking similar HOA corruption cases across the region. When I shared my documentation of the pattern in Willowbrook Estates, Patricia immediately recognized the significance of what we had uncovered. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute about gardening preferences. This was organized criminal activity that violated multiple state and federal laws related to conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary responsibility. Patricia's investigation began with a public records request that revealed financial documents showing the flow of money between the HOA, Harrison Landscaping Services, and shell companies owned by board members that had purchased foreclosed properties at below-market prices. The financial connections were so clear that even Margaret's attempts to conceal the relationships through complex corporate structures couldn't hide the obvious pattern of self-dealing and profit manipulation that had driven every major decision the board had made for the past 5 years. The story broke on a Thursday evening with a segment called HOA Havoc, How Community Leaders Became Community Predators, that included interviews with displaced families, financial records showing the scope of the corruption, and hidden camera footage of board meetings where Margaret and her allies discussed strategies for targeting specific residents. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with dozens of current and former residents calling the station to report similar experiences and provide additional evidence of systematic abuse that extended far beyond anything we had initially documented. Within 48 hours of the news broadcast, the State Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation into criminal violations by the Willowbrook Estates HOA Board, and federal authorities began examining the case for potential prosecution under racketeering statutes that treat organized criminal enterprises with the same legal tools used against traditional organized crime families. Margaret Harrison's landscaping company lost several major contracts within a week, and property management companies throughout the region began reviewing their own practices to avoid similar scrutiny. The legal resolution came faster than anyone had expected, primarily because the evidence of corruption was so extensive and well documented that defending the board's actions would have been virtually impossible. Margaret Harrison and 2 other board members were arrested on charges including fraud, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty, and racketeering that carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. The remaining board members resigned immediately and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges and immunity from civil liability. More importantly for our community, the court appointed an independent management company to oversee Willowbrook Estates. During a comprehensive review of all HOA regulations, enforcement actions, and financial transactions from the previous 5 years, every fine imposed during Margaret's tenure was reviewed by neutral arbitrators, and residents who had been victims of discriminatory enforcement received full refunds plus damages for legal fees and other costs they had incurred while fighting illegitimate violations. The Thompsons got their retirement savings back with interest, and the court ordered that their former home be sold at fair market value, with the proceeds going to a fund that would compensate other victims of the board's criminal activities. 5 other families received similar compensation, and several residents who had been living in fear of targeted harassment finally felt safe to maintain their properties according to their own preferences, rather than the arbitrary whims of corrupt board members. My roses not only survived the ordeal, they became a symbol of resistance that inspired other residents to reclaim their community from people who had treated it as a personal profit center rather than a place where families built their lives and dreams. Mrs. Hartwell, who had been following the news coverage from her assisted living facility, sent me a letter that brought tears to my eyes and reminded me why some battles are worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. "Sarah, dear," she wrote in her shaky handwriting, "I knew when I met you that you had the strength to protect something beautiful from people who only see dollar signs where others see irreplaceable heritage. Your courage has saved not just my roses, but the soul of our community. Thank you for keeping your promise and proving that one person standing up for what's right can make a difference that changes everything." The new HOA board, elected by residents, rather than appointed by Margaret's inner circle, adopted regulations that balance community standards with respect for individual property rights and personal expression. The approved plant list was expanded to include heritage varieties and native species that support local wildlife. Height restrictions were modified to allow mature landscaping that enhances rather than threatens property values. And the enforcement process now includes appeal procedures and neutral arbitration that prevent the kind of targeted harassment that had driven families from their homes. Margaret Harrison was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution that will fund community improvements and legal assistance for HOA abuse victims throughout the region. Her landscaping company was dissolved, and the exclusive service contracts that had generated illegal profits were replaced with competitive bidding processes that give residents choices about maintenance services, while ensuring that community standards are maintained fairly and consistently. Looking back on this experience 2 years later, I realized that what started as a dispute about roses became something much more significant, a reminder that communities belong to the people who live in them, not to the people who claim authority over them. When we allow fear of conflict to silence our voices against injustice, we create opportunities for corruption that can destroy the very things we thought we were protecting. Today, Mrs. Hartwell's garden blooms more beautifully than ever, with new varieties added each season and educational tours that teach visitors about the importance of preserving heritage plants and the techniques that keep them thriving. The garden has become a gathering place where neighbors meet to share stories, celebrate community events, and remember that the most valuable things in life cannot be standardized, regulated, or controlled by people who mistake power for wisdom. If you're facing similar battles with an HOA that has forgotten its purpose, remember that you have more power than they want you to believe. Document everything, research the financial connections that might be driving enforcement decisions, and never hesitate to seek help from journalists, attorneys, and advocacy organizations that specialize in protecting homeowner rights. Most importantly, remember that you're not fighting alone, and that communities thrive when residents have the courage to stand up for each other against bullies who abuse positions of trust for personal gain. The roses still bloom every spring, just as Mrs. Hartwell promised they would, and they serve as a daily reminder that beauty and justice can survive even the most determined attempts to destroy them. Sometimes the most important victories come not from avoiding conflict, but from having the courage to fight for things that matter more than our own comfort and convenience.